But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. Love, Love, a wonderful word, is it? And it appears everyone understands it, whether a believer or not. Well, not necessarily in practice, but at least everyone really familiarizes him or herself with love. Let me tell you a story. Within the mid 1700s, the Atlantic Ocean was the center of one of the darkest enterprises in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Ships crossed the ocean carrying thousands of enslaved Africans in brutal conditions. Among the captains involved in this trade was an Englishman named John Newton. Newton was not merely a participant, he was actually deeply immersed in the system. Newton commanded slave ships. Newton transported human cargo across the Atlantic. He lived a life marked by profanity, drunkenness, and even moral indifference. By his own admission, he was a man who had sunk into spiritual darkness. Then something happened. Something very important happened. And I want to, on this note, welcome you back to Steady Insights. I believe you have been well. In our discourse, in this episode, we will highlight wonderfully how it is important to have a new life. And you might be asking yourself, why did I even begin with love? Well, before you get irritated, just bear with me. We are going to talk about something that is very profound. You hear themes like baptism, new life, old life. But what do these things really mean? Especially to people who are not familiar with teachings as far as living a new life is concerned. As we have come this far, I believe you have recognized how powerfully Paul within the New Testament, especially in Colossians and Philippians, tries to discuss the importance of living a righteous life. And we have delved deeper into how we can grow and reconcile with the hope that we have in Christ. In our previous episode, we gracefully discovered how important it is to live with hope, how important it is to be connected such that we are having the hope in Christ and not in mere practices like circumcision and the rest, because they are all things that were nailed to the cross. Ceremonial laws were only pointing to Christ. Well, when we are buried in the waters of baptism, as we will discover, we die to our old life of sin. And wonderfully, when we come out of the water, we rise as new creatures. This sounds a bit absurd, especially in the context of our worldly definition. How can you die by way of going into water? Well, basically, you require some sense of direction to really fathom this. And as we continue, it becomes clearer. For people who believe, it is very clear that those who have been baptized live differently, or at least are expected to live differently, and that they are to stop having earthly mindset and acquire new heavenly mindset. However, as many believers have identified, which I believe you listening have also seen, for some reason, many people who undergo baptisms see their old ways that try to resurface. And this is the most important pivot that Paul is directed to. And he urges all believers to set their sights on heaven. Now, how do you really reconcile this? How can we set our sights on heaven while we are living in the world? How can we be earthly or heavenly minded? So, in this discourse, we try to look at our focus, what it means to die to earthly things, and to clothe oneself with the celestial. And with this, it becomes important to discuss the characteristics of a new life in Christ. What at all is the bond of perfectness? Let's delve deeper. Earthly or heavenly mindset. Remember, I began with love. Well, here is where it all begins. You see, our focus as a people are being directed to not earthly things, but on things above. And Paul begins this assertion. Remember, we are still within the book of Colossians by telling us this powerful assumption. He says, if we are raised with Christ, it appears this statement refers to baptism, which Paul had described earlier in Colossians chapter 2. So basically, starting from the reasoning that we have been raised with Christ in baptism, Paul is advising that we follow Christ to the place where he went after his resurrection. That is the throne of God. Baptism, in this case, symbolizes two realities: the death of the old life and the resurrection into a new life. Well, we will only be able to do what Christ did going to heaven physically when Jesus comes down. Of course, during the second coming. But in the meantime, we are being advised to set our goals on heavenly things. So, what does this really mean? Well, through baptism, we have died. Many people, believers who have been baptized, died within the waters. However, by the power of Christ's resurrection, we have been made alive and we are hid in Christ. The life that we speak of is that which is received when we accept Christ. Carefully, Paul says, set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. It does not necessarily mean ignoring daily responsibilities, but it means our ultimate priorities must change. In order to remain alive, one needs to be nourished daily. And every day we must seek things above. The believer's true life is now secured in Christ, and that one day hidden reality will become visible. The question is, if we have truly died to the old life, then something must also die in our behavior. Now, Paul asks us what dies, and through this, he moves from theology to practice. If our focus is to rise with Christ and die to old self, what does it really mean to die to earthly things, or basically to die to our old self? We have risen with Christ, and that is about thinking of the heavenly things. By that, we put to death that which prevents us from fulfilling our goal, as many people would think. Paul says, put to death that which is earthly in you. And Paul is basically pointing out fundamental pillars of earthly thinking. And he will try to explain these in the context of sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed. Basically, it is not a suggestion. This is a decisive action being proposed by Paul. Human nature has never changed. And many of us do understand that even after growing in Christ or still growing in Christ, we are surrounded by the same passions that violate both the letter and the spirit of the Ten Commandments. So basically, Paul tells us that the behaviors consisting of immoralities, impurity, lust, and evil desires belong to the old world and not the new life in Christ. Basically, the logic is this: if we belong to Christ's kingdom, we cannot continue living according to the values of the fallen world. And as one commentator said, kill the earthly before the earthly kills you. What more to say? Now, what happens after we've actually killed the earthly? To clothe oneself with the celestial, Paul continues with another list, and in a proverbial style, he tells us basically anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language are not supposed to be encouraged. He actually continues with the sixth act, and that is the worst of all: do not lie to each other. Whoa, we live in a world where lies are so predominant. In fact, in certain cultures, lying is so acceptable that to tell the truth becomes so much unheard of. I remember I've had opportunities speaking with people and they ask you about what you think of them. And the moment you tell them the truth, they really tell you, in this place, you ought to pretend sometimes. And I tell myself, how can I pretend if it is about my opinion? The world in which we live welcomes lies so much that many people will respond, I am alright, even though they are dying within. This language echoes the imagery of removing filthy clothing. And basically, what Paul says is to strip oneself of garments that are unkempt and to put on fine garments. When one is clothed in new garments, one is continually renewed and grows in holiness day by day. Well, Paul says this new life is really a transformation that is ongoing. And as believers are renewed, something remarkable happens. Old social divisions disappear. Well, if the old life is gone, what exactly does the new life look like? And that brings us to the characteristics of the new life in Christ. I hope you have not forgotten about how I began. Love. Putting on love. When we resurrect with Christ through baptism, we now have tasted the full rigor of what love really is. That Christ died for us, and we are now declared righteous. But what happens after that? And that brings me back to the story of John Newton. Like I said, he had admitted himself as one who had sunk into spiritual darkness. But in the late 1700s, something happened. In March 1748, Newton's ship was caught in a violent storm in the North Atlantic. Waves battered the vessel for hours, and they threatened to sink it. He was convinced that he would die, so Newton, who hitherto had not been so much of a believer, cried out to God for mercy. The ship survived, but Newton was not the same man afterward. The change did not occur overnight, but gradually the transformation deepened. Eventually, Newton abandoned the slave trade entirely. He became a minister. And years later, as many people have known him for, he wrote the hymn that would become one of the most famous songs in Christian history. And I believe you've heard it. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Newton understood something profound. Grace is not merely about forgiveness. Grace creates a new life. The old identity dies, a new identity begins. And that is what Paul clarifies in the chapter 3 of Colossians. What are then the bonds of perfectness? What are the characteristics of a really transformed life? So Paul says, above all things, put on love, which is the bond of perfectness. We are God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. And we are told of our identity, being chosen of God, being holy and deeply loved. By this, how does one of God's chosen behave? Well, Paul says, with tender mercy. And that eventually leads to us being kind. When one is kind, ultimately, it embodies humility. With such humility, meekness of spirit is required. Then it becomes more prominent that such people who have nurtured these four prerequisites have long suffering. They are not quick to act or quick tempered. And of course, because we deal with people, such ones forbear with one another. And carefully, even if one transcends the barrier to disturb their peace, they are quick to forgive. The only way you can nurture all these things is when you fully understand and have benefited from that which is the bond of perfectness, love. What are the benefits? Well, our benefits and responsibilities are clearly defined. By behaving this way, we are a blessing to both others and ourselves. Tell me, how many times do you really feel bad for really knowing that you've done the right thing? It's so much freeing and wonderful to know that you did the right thing. Nonetheless, when you did the otherwise, it becomes more like a guilt hanging on your neck. Basically, our responsibility now becomes to glorify God and that it encourages others. Wow, the heavenly food. So we are told that it is important to really nurture and feed our heavenly nature. Well, we cannot do this in isolation. We need the fellowship of the church, and that is why it is significant that in the believer's journey, we are not only limited to our isolated service. No, it is letting the peace of God rule us. And that really helps us to remain unanimous as one body in the church. We are grateful for one another and we study extensively the Bible in order that we may know and to teach each other what we have learned. We share spiritual songs. We do everything in the name of Christ. And that is what really propels us to move on together. Wow, this is the heavenly food. When we have acquainted ourselves with these, we do not only transform from our old life, but we grow into a life that is worthy of emulation for others. John Newton never forgot who he once was. He was a slave trader, a man lost in darkness, but grace transformed his life. And when he wrote Amazing Grace, he captured the essence of Paul's teaching in Colossians chapter 3. The believer's life is not merely about believing in Christ, it's about living with Christ. The old life dies, the new life grows, and day by day the believer is transformed until the moment when Christ appears and the life that is now hidden is finally revealed in glory. What is your life?